They say she was laid to rest within the Tower of London, but others swear she's buried hundreds of miles away, or that her heart lies elsewhere. Every year on the 19th of May, a quiet, moving tribute takes place inside the Tower of London. A basket of red roses is laid on the memorial tile of Queen Anne Boleyn, the most infamous of Henry VIII's wives. But is that really where she rests? I'm Claire Ridgway, historian, author of several books on Anne Boleyn, including the Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown, and founder of the Anne Boleyn Files website. And in this video, I'm diving into the truth and the myths about Anne's final resting place. We'll look at the contemporary evidence, explore the legends that place her in churches far from the Tower, examine the Victorian exhumations, and consider whether the bones beneath her memorial tile really are those of the executed Queen. On the 19th of May 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII and mother of Queen Elizabeth I, was executed by beheading within the confines of the Tower of London. But where was she buried? Well, we have multiple contemporary sources that all state that she was buried in the choir of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, one of the chapels royal at the Tower of London. Chronicler and Windsor Herald Charles Risley wrote, "Her body with the head was buried in the chapel within the Tower of London, in the choir there, the same day at afternoon, when she'd reigned as Queen 3 years, lacking 14 days from her coronation to her death." A contemporary document in the Vienna archive states, "Immediately the executioner did his office, and when her head was off, it was taken by a young lady and covered with a white cloth. Afterwards the body was taken by the other ladies and the whole carried into the church nearest to the Tower of London." Lancelot de Carle, secretary to the French ambassador and someone who was in London to witness Anne's fall in 1536, recorded, "And this dead body was carried by the nearly dead, wrapped in a white blanket, up to the place of sad burial, inside the tower where she'd been a prisoner, which would also be her final resting place." And chronicler Raphael Holinshed wrote, "Her body with the head was buried in the choir of the chapel in the Tower." And we know from contemporary sources that her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, had also been laid to rest there after his execution 2 days earlier. None of them mention any further details regarding her burial, although it's often said that Anne's remains were laid in an elm chest fetched from the Tower Armoury, which had once contained bow staves, because no coffin had been supplied for the former Queen's burial. This extra detail comes from notes made by scholar Thomas Turner, or Tourneur, president of Corpus Christi College in the late 17th century, interleaved, as historians John Guy and Julia Fox explain, with his copy of the 1649 edition of Lord Herbert at Cherbury's The Life and Reign of King Henry VIII. Natalie Gröninger, in her book The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, challenges the story of the elm chest, writing that the original source is a diary by Anthony that has been lost for centuries, and which, as she says, is known only through Turner's notes. She concludes that without the original diary, it's impossible to verify Tourneur's recollection. True. But he was a scholar, and as Guy and Fox explain in their book Hunting the Falcon, he wrote that his notes came out of an old original diary or journal wrote with the proper hand of one Mr. Anthony, the said Anthony being a contemporary to the action and, as he saith himself, an eye and ear witness. So it sounds like Turner's notes were based on a contemporary source and that he was being careful. C.S. Knighton, in his and David Lowes' book The Antony Roll of Henry VIII's Navy, explains that Antony's chronicle of events from 1522 to 1558 was known to the other 16th century historians Stowe and Holinshed and was referred to by Bishop Burnet in his History of the Reformation, and that extracts were also made by the antiquary Elias Ashmole in 1659. But who was Anthony? Well, he was a gunner at the Tower of London in the 1530s and a clerk at the Ordnance at the Tower, who later became surveyor of the Ordnance. Guy and Fox also state that he was a groom of Henry VIII's Privy Chamber. You may have heard of the Anthony Roll, an inventory of the ships that made up Henry VIII's Royal Navy in the 1540s. It was named after Anthony, who's believed to have created it. C.S. Knighton explains that Anthony's chronicle presented the view of the world from the Tower of London, including the coming and going of prisoners. Working at the Tower, he was a witness to key events there and may well have been involved in fetching the elm chest for the Queen's burial. While I can't say that Turner made a mistake in his notes, I don't see any real reason to doubt his recollection of Anthony's account. I guess we'll never know unless Anthony's work turns up in an archive somewhere. However, what we do know is that Anne was buried in the choir at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But is she still there? Well, there's a long-standing Norfolk legend that says Anne's final resting place isn't in the tower at all. Agnes Strickland, the 19th century historian, wrote about what she called a curious tradition from Anne's native Norfolk. According to this story, Anne's remains were secretly removed from the Tower of London at night and taken to Saul Church, the resting place of some of Anne's ancestors, including her great-grandparents Geoffrey and Alice Boleyn. There, the tale claims, she was buried at midnight beneath a plain black marble slab, receiving the holy rites her husband had denied her. Strickland admitted there was no real evidence for the story, but she did quote a line from poet Sir Thomas Wyatt. God provided for her corpse sacred burial, even in a place, as it were, consecrate to innocence. She speculated that perhaps Wyatt knew of the secret and had even been involved in moving her remains. Author Nora Lofts later wrote about visiting Saul Church. She recalled being shown the black marble slab by the sexton, who told her it had never been lifted because of the church's patron, who wouldn't allow it. He also shared a spooky local tradition that every year on the anniversary of Anne's execution, her ghost walked in the church. One year, while keeping vigil on the night of the 19th of May, the sexton claimed a large hare had appeared and led him on a fine chase through the church. Lofts, with a wry smile, had told him that hares were once thought to be one of the forms a witch could take at will, and Lofts wrote that Anne was said by her enemies to be a witch, which actually is a load of rubbish. That is a modern invention. In more recent times, historian Alison Weir has said the story was debunked when the slab was eventually lifted and nothing was found underneath. However, the Reap and Benefice website, which covers Saul Church, makes no mention of the slab ever having been opened. So perhaps the mystery isn't entirely closed. And Saul isn't the only place said to hold Anne Boleyn's remains, or at least part of her. Agnes Strickland also recorded another rumour, this time from Essex. She wrote that in the ancient church of Horndon-on-the-Hill, a plain black marble monument is pointed out by locals as the true resting place of the executed queen. Strickland believed that this legend, like the Saul Church story, probably grew from old rumours among the tenants and retainers of the Boleyn family. And these whispers claimed that Anne's body had been secretly removed from the Tower Chapel, and the whispers were passed down through the generations as fact. And then there's perhaps the strangest story of all, the one about Anne's heart. According to local tradition, Anne loved visiting Irweston Hall in Suffolk, the home of her uncle Sir Philip Parker, so much that she asked for her heart to be buried in the nearby parish church of St Mary's. In 1838, during renovations to the church, it was said that a heart-shaped casket was discovered in an alcove in the north aisle. The legend says that it was Sir Philip himself who placed it there. The casket was reburied beneath the organ, and today a plaque declares that Anne Boleyn's heart lies in that very spot. Historian Alison Weir points out a few problems with this romantic tale. Firstly, Weir states that heart burial had largely fallen out of fashion by the late 14th century. Well, I have to disagree with that, as we know from records that Jane Seymour's heart was buried in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace, while her body lies at St George's Chapel at Windsor. Weir also points out that Anne's aunt, Amata Boleyn, was actually married to a Sir Philip Calthorpe, not a Sir Philip Parker. Still, true or not, the village clearly loves the connection. The local pub is called the Queen's Head. These claims are just legends. We know from contemporary sources that Anne was buried at St Peter ad Vincula, and there's no report of her resting place being at all disturbed in the 16th century. The Victorians also believed that they exhumed the Queen's remains from the choir or chancel of the chapel in 1876. Now, they didn't do this out of morbid curiosity. Restoration work was being carried out on the chapel, and the floor of the chancel or choir was found to be sinking. The ground needed to be cleared so that proper foundations could be put in. So it was decided that the remains in that area should be carefully exhumed and moved to the crypt. Doyne C. Bell, secretary to Queen Victoria's Privy Purse, was in charge of making a full record of the restorations, including the exhumations. And I've actually got his records here. This is his book that was published in 1877, and it's got all of the notes, memorandums, everything, and then biographies of people that were buried at in the chapel. So a really, really good primary source. He wrote that the remains were carefully collected and enclosed in boxes with suitable inscriptions, and all the coffins which were found intact were at once removed to the crypt. Bell used historical sources to create a plan of the resting places of those buried in the chancel, which included Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, along with the Dukes of Somerset, Northumberland and Monmouth. And it was decided that any remains found should be reinterred on the same spot and labelled. When the pavement was lifted in the spot believed to be Anne Boleyn's resting place, and he used tower records to identify that, the remains of a woman were discovered about 2 feet below the surface. The bones weren't neatly arranged in a skeleton as in an undisturbed burial. Instead, they'd clearly been gathered together and placed in a smaller space for some reason. Professor of Medicine Dr. Frederick J. Muat examined them and recorded, "The bones found in the place where Queen Anne Boleyn is said to have been buried are certainly those of a female in the prime of life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." He felt that they were consistent with contemporary descriptions of the Queen and was in no doubt that they belonged to Anne. Records from the exhumations state that close to Anne were the remains of 2 men aged about 50, which fit with the Dukes of Somerset and Northumberland being buried between Anne and her cousin Catherine Howard, although Catherine's remains were never found. Bell recorded that the remains found in the chancel were soldered up in thick leaden coffers and then fastened down with copper screws in boxes made of oak plank 1 inch in thickness. Each box bore a leaden escutcheon on which was engraved the name of the person whose supposed remains were thus enclosed, together with the dates of death and of the year 1877 of the reinterment. They were then placed in the respective positions in the chancel in which the remains had been found, and the ground having been opened, they were all buried about 4 inches below the surface. The earth was then filled in and concrete immediately spread over them. A beautiful memorial tile bearing her arms, her name and title, Queen Anne Boleyn, and the year of her death mark the spot. And each year on the anniversary of Anne's execution, people make a pilgrimage to the tower and leave flowers on the glass memorial on Tower Green, or ask the yeoman warders to lay their flowers on Anne's memorial tile. There is also a beautiful tradition. Every year, without fail, a basket of red roses is delivered to the tower. The accompanying card reads, "Queen Anne Boleyn, 19th of May, 1536. The basket is always delivered by courier, and a yeoman warder takes it to the chapel and places it on Anne's tile. According to news reports, Major General Christopher Tyler, governor and keeper of the Jewel House at the Tower of London from 1989 to 1994, carried out a bit of detective work into the mystery of the roses. He apparently discovered that the descendants of the Boleyn family living in Kent were behind the annual tribute, and that their relatives before them had done the same. The florist nearest the tower confirmed they'd been fulfilling the order since the 1850s, although in more recent years it had been transferred to a florist in a Kent village close to the descendants' home. When I spoke to the chief yeoman warder about the roses back in 2010, he told me he believed the arrangement was part of a bequest, one that would continue year after year until the funds eventually ran out. Whatever the truth of the matter, it's a lovely tradition and one that the yeoman warders take very seriously. Have you seen the basket of roses, or have you been to the tower on the 19th of May and taken your own flowers? I have, and I was allowed to lay them on Anne's tile, which was so very moving, something that I will remember forever. Now, I know that someone watching or listening to this will point out Alison Weir's argument that the remains under Anne's tile might not be hers at all, and instead be those of Catherine Howard, and that Anne is buried underneath Lady Rochford's tile. But I don't see the merit in that argument at all. Let me explain. In The Lady in the Tower, Alison Weir examines the Victorian discoveries and Dr. Muat's 1876 examination of the remains. Muat estimated the skeleton's age at between 25 and 30, describing the woman as having a square, full chin. Weir argues that this doesn't match the widely accepted birth year of 1501, which would make Anne around 35 at her death, and that it doesn't fit with known depictions of her. She suggests it's just possible that the bones belong instead to Catherine Howard, noting that Holbein's miniature of Catherine shows what could be a pronounced square jaw. Weir then looks at another skeleton found in the spot traditionally associated with Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Muat described those bones as those of a woman of rather delicate proportions and about 30 to 40 years of age. Weir identifies them as Anne, reasoning that Lady Rochford, born around 1512, would have been in her late 20s at the time of her death. She concludes that Anne's memorial tile may not actually mark her true resting place, and that she may lie beneath Lady Rochford's. I'm really not convinced at all. Doyne C. Bell, Secretary to Her Majesty's Privy Purse and a member of the committee overseeing the chapel's 19th century restoration, mapped out burial locations in the chancel based on extensive consultation of historical records. The remains Muat examined were exactly where Bell recorded Anne as being buried, and no other female bones were found there. Meanwhile, the 35 to 40-year-old female found in the Howard Rochford grave could just as easily have been Lady Rochford. To my mind, that makes it far more likely that the bones under Anne's tile are in fact hers. And we have to remember that Dr. Muat was a doctor in the 19th century. He wasn't using the technology that we have today to identify the bones or to age the bones. And by the way, historians are now challenging the identification of the sitter of Holbein's miniature, which was once said to be Catherine Howard anyway. That's the miniature that Alison Weir was talking about. It may well be Anne of Cleves, that's the idea now, but that's a whole other story. When we strip away the legends, the romantic tales and the speculation, we're left with a clear thread running through the evidence, from the contemporary accounts of her burial in the chapel to the Victorian records placing her exactly where her memorial tile is today. The Victorians were meticulous in recording what they found, and the remains matched what we know of Anne in stature, build, and even the famous little neck described by Anne herself. No credible source records her body being moved, and the supposed alternative burial sites rely entirely on unsubstantiated local tradition. For me, there's no compelling reason to believe Anne Boleyn rests anywhere other than beneath her memorial tile in the choir of St. Peter ad Vincula, alongside other notable figures whose lives and deaths were bound up with the turbulent Tudor court. It's a simple, dignified spot for a queen whose life and death still capture our imagination nearly 5 centuries later. So whether you believe she lies beneath the memorial tile in the Tower of London, or that her remains found their way back to Norfolk or Suffolk, Anne Boleyn's story, even in death, continues to fascinate and inspire. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into Tudor history, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my future videos. And if you'd like to take your Tudor journey even further, then do consider joining my YouTube channel membership. You'll get exclusive printable resources, behind the scenes content, a monthly magazine, and even live Zoom discussions with me. Just click the join button on YouTube. I'll see you soon for more Tudor tales. Take care. Bye bye.